Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a fascinating study today titled Accelerating the Renewable Energy Revolution to Get Back to the Holocene. Now, right from the jump, this paper really throws down a challenge to what we often hear about climate action.
It absolutely does. Yeah, it takes a pretty critical look at the conventional targets, aiming to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And the authors argue these goals are uh, dangerously obsolete.
Dangerously obsolete. Wow, that's a really strong claim. I mean, those numbers are what we hear about constantly. So if those aren't the right targets, what does this study propose instead?
Well, this study makes the case that just aiming to sort of mitigate warming isn't enough anymore. The necessary goal, they argue, is climate restoration. Specifically, getting back to climate conditions similar to the Holocene epoch, that relatively stable period, the last 11,000 years or so, that allowed human civilization to flourish.
Right.
And they believe this is not only necessary, but, well, potentially achievable within about a century.
Climate restoration. Back to the Holocene. That feels like a massive shift, a completely different framing from just trying to limit how bad things get. What makes them think that's even possible now?
That's where the second big part of their argument comes in. They say that recent, maybe even unexpected, advances in renewable energy tech and energy storage have fundamentally changed the picture. They say it's radically expanded our climate response capacity.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive, right? We need to understand why this study believes the current targets are obsolete. What specific dangers do they see in just aiming for 1.5 or 2 degrees? And then how does this renewable revolution provide the opportunity for a much more ambitious goal? And finally, what practical steps do the authors suggest are needed to actually accelerate towards this climate restoration idea?
Exactly. And there's something critical this study really emphasizes, which often gets less attention. It's the enormous human health and economic costs of fossil fuel pollution itself, quite separate from the warming it causes. They argue these costs are vast, often underestimated, and it's a core reason they say the current targets are just not sufficient.
Okay, let's start there then. Why, according to the study, are the 1.5 or 2 degree goals that the world talks about, why are they not sufficient, not safe?
Well, the authors begin by pointing out that despite overwhelming evidence of, widespread disruption happening now, many still treat the 1.5 degree C target as acceptable, or at least maybe the best we can hope for. But their analysis suggests that sustained warming at or above 1.5 degrees C would cause, well, immense damage to human society and trigger a pervasive decline of life on Earth.
And they get specific about those severe consequences, don't they? It's not just some abstract warming number.
Right. They highlight the risk of triggering multiple Earth system tipping elements. Those critical thresholds where small changes can lead to really large, potentially irreversible shifts in major Earth systems.
Like the giant ice sheets, for instance.
Precisely. They note, for example, that the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica have been losing mass since around the year 2000, which suggests that maybe even less than 0.5 degrees C of warming above pre-industrial levels might be what's needed just to stabilize them.
Less than half a degree.
Yeah, and their analysis points to recent observations tracking the more extreme model estimates for sea level rise. This means we could be looking at up to 9 meters of sea level rise in the coming centuries,
9 meters.
just from the ice sheets that are already destabilized. Think about the displacement. Hundreds of millions, potentially billions of people.
Hundreds of millions to billions. That's a truly staggering number. It really brings the scale of the risk home.
And it's not just ice. This study also raises alarms about disruption to ocean circulation, the total loss of tropical coral reefs, widespread ocean deoxygenation. Then there's the collapse of fisheries, the weakening ability of forests and soils to absorb carbon, our natural sinks, and of course the destabilization of our global food and water systems. These are fundamental life support systems we're talking about.
But this study puts a massive focus on something else, too, something that isn't always central to climate discussions in quite the same way: the direct impact of fossil fuel pollution.
Yes, this is a crucial part of their argument for why current targets are obsolete. They really emphasize that continuing to use fossil fuels, even in scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees C, would lead to hundreds of millions of avoidable premature deaths just from the air pollution.
Hundreds of millions.
Yeah, they point out that right now, pollution is already causing about 1 in 5 premature deaths globally and costing the world something like US $10 trillion annually in economic damages.
10 trillion a year now.
And projecting forward to 2250 in typical 1.5 degrees C plus scenarios compared to their clean energy pathway, they estimate Well, the potential for 0.11 to 5.3 billion premature deaths, and costs ranging from U.S. generated 23 cents to 6.8 quadrillion.
Billion, quadrillion. Those numbers are they're almost impossible to get your head around. It highlights a scale of human suffering and economic burden that feels uh, different.
It does. And the authors argue this really highlights a cost of fossil fuels that is often overshadowed by the focus just on greenhouse gas emissions. They point out that the pollution costs, the human health damage, the economic damage, are a much larger component of the total cost of fossil fuels than, say, future cost of carbon capture. In their assessment, pollution costs represent a mean of 81% of the total costs.
81%. So most of the cost of burning fossil fuels today isn't even the future warming, it's the present-day pollution.
That's what this study suggests, yeah. And because of this, they also introduce a concept they call gigaton years.
Gigaton years. Okay, what does that measure?
It's a metric designed to capture the risk of triggering those tipping points we talked about. They argue that the risk doesn't just depend on the maximum temperature reached, but crucially, on the duration that the global temperature stays elevated above those Holocene-like conditions.
Oh, okay.
Think of it as cumulative exposure time to dangerous warming levels. The longer we remain significantly warmer than the climate our civilization actually developed in, the higher the risk of hitting one of those critical thresholds.
Ah, I see. So even if we manage to bring temperatures back down later, maybe using technologies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, that period of overshoot at higher temperatures still carries significant risk because of that exposure time.
Exactly. The study estimates that scenarios involving significant temperature overshoot increase the risk of triggering tipping elements by about 70% compared to pathways that avoid overshoot altogether. This underscores why preventing a ton of CO2 emissions now is far more valuable than removing it later. Delaying action significantly increases the overall risk.
That really reframes the urgency beyond just hitting a peak temperature number. It's about minimizing the time spent in dangerous territory. And based on all these dangers, the tipping points, the sea level rise, and especially those massive pollution costs, this study makes a pretty strong moral case, doesn't it?
It really does. The authors call the continued use of fossil fuels, with these known costs and risks, irresponsible and morally unacceptable. They argue it places an immense unfair burden on future generations, particularly through those millions, potentially billions, of pollution deaths.
So the fundamental question we should be asking ourselves needs to change then. It's not how much more fossil fuel can we kind of afford to burn before hitting some temperature limit?
Right. Their proposed shift in mindset is to ask, what is the safest and fastest way back to the Holocene?
Okay, that question shifts us nicely from the problem and its scale to the potential solution. Because while the premise sounds, well, pretty dire, this study presents a surprisingly optimistic picture of the opportunity we now have. They talk about a renewable revolution. What exactly do they mean by that?
This is where the story definitely brightens considerably. The authors highlight that the speed and scale of technological advancement in renewable power production and storage have vastly exceeded expectations. They say these advances have radically expanded our climate response capacity. Basically, technology has progressed decades faster than projected, even just a few years ago.
And this study has some really striking numbers on how much costs have dropped, right?
Absolutely staggering numbers, yeah. They point to data, like in their Figure 1, showing that the levelized cost of energy, which is essentially the total cost to build and operate a power plant over its lifetime, divided by the energy it produces.
Right, the LCOU.
Exactly, the LCOE. For solar PV, it's down 91% since 2009.
91%.
And onshore wind costs, down 71% over the same period. They state it very clearly. Renewables are now the cheapest form of electricity generation in history, and costs are projected to keep falling.
Okay, but what about energy storage? That's always been seen as a major hurdle, for relying heavily on intermittent sources like solar and wind.
Storage costs have fallen even faster, actually. Lithium-ion battery costs, for example, are down 95% since 2009.
95%. Wow.
And they're projected to drop another 90% by 2040. The authors note that utility-scale batteries have actually been the cheapest way to meet daily peak power demand since about 2019.
So it's not just that the electricity itself is cheap, it's that the supporting technology for a reliable grid is also rapidly becoming cost-effective.
Exactly. This study emphasizes that these technological advances now provide technologically and economically viable pathways to directly and indirectly electrify every major sector of the economy. We're talking transportation, heating, heavy industry. They state that grid stability and reliability can be achieved using existing technology combinations.
And is the market actually responding to this rapid change? Are we seeing this happen?
It is. Definitely. Renewable energy sources made up 83% of all new power capacity added globally in 2022, and they are projected to account for 95% of global power growth through 2025.
95%.
Yeah. The study gives some compelling examples of countries and regions achieving very high renewable energy levels quickly and affordably. Places like Vietnam, Denmark, Uruguay, even places like South Dakota, the US, and South Australia. South Australia went from 1% to 70% renewable electricity in just 15 years.
15 years, incredible.
And they're on track for 100% by 2025.
That trajectory is already pretty clear then. And the socioeconomic implications. This study really challenges that old idea that a rapid transition requires major economic sacrifice.
Yeah, this is another core finding that really pushes back against conventional wisdom. The authors argue that a rapid transition to clean energy is actually macroeconomically profitable. They estimate significant financial savings, somewhere between $5 and $12 trillion through 2070, just from the energy system costs compared to a business-as-usual fossil fuel path.
So just running the energy system itself is cheaper with renewables, without even counting other benefits.
Yes. But, as we discussed earlier, their analysis also factors in those massive health and environmental co-benefits from avoiding pollution and climate damages. When you include those, the estimated savings balloon to a staggering $31 to $775 trillion.
Trillion with a T.
Trillion. They highlight that the faster we deploy clean energy and retire old fossil fuel infrastructure early, the larger these savings become.
Because you're stopping those huge pollution costs we talked about earlier, cutting them off sooner.
Precisely. Remember that finding that pollution costs account for, on average, 81% of the total cost of fossil fuels. Accelerating the transition eliminates those costs much faster.
Are there other benefits this study highlights beyond just the financial ones, important as those are?
Absolutely. They note that this transition allows for simultaneous decreases in emissions and increases in electricity access, particularly in low and middle income countries. This helps address environmental injustice, as the greatest benefits tend to be concentrated in communities most affected by fossil fuel pollution.
Good point.
They also point to geopolitical benefits, like reducing reliance on volatile global fossil fuel markets and increasing energy independence. This can help reduce energy-related conflicts.
So it really sounds like this study is arguing that the common narrative, the one about the difficulty and high cost of transitioning away from fossil fuels, is just fundamentally outdated. Like, it hasn't caught up with the reality of the renewable revolution's speed and cost declines.
That's exactly their critique.
Yeah.
Yeah, they contrast the observed rapid progress with older projections and what they call doomerism, suggesting that a lot of the pessimism out there is based on information that's simply no longer current.
Okay, so if the current targets are obsolete and pose unacceptable risks, and if the opportunity presented by renewables is this massive, even profitable, what is the actual path forward that this study proposes to achieve that climate restoration goal? How do we get there?
Well, the path, as outlined in this study, really starts with accepting that climate restoration, a rapid return to Holocene-like conditions, is the necessary goal. Because, as they put it, there is no safe level of climate disruption, and our goal must be to get back to the Holocene.
Right, establishing the goal first. And how do we actually get there? What are the practical steps?
The primary practical step they suggest is aggressively building out clean energy infrastructure and, crucially, retiring dirty fossil fuel infrastructure early. They emphasize that the fossil fuel plants and infrastructure we already have today are sufficient to push warming past 2 degrees C if we just use them for their full planned lifetimes.
Oh, wow.
So relying solely on future carbon capture technologies is, they argue, much riskier and more costly than accelerating the shift to renewables now and phasing out fossil fuels ahead of schedule.
And policy and financing are the key levers for making that happen quickly.
Absolutely crucial. The study highlights that low interest rates and targeted financing mechanisms, like discounted loans or grants, are essential. They help overcome the upfront capital costs of building renewables, even though the lifetime costs are cheaper. And they stress that this kind of investment is highly profitable at a national level because of the positive impacts on energy prices, job creation, public health from reduced pollution, and energy security.
And there's a big equity piece to the financing, too, isn't there?
Yes, a really important one. They point out that low and middle income countries currently receive less than 8% of global clean energy investment. Yet their populations suffer 92% of the premature deaths from fossil fuel pollution.
That disparity is huge.
It is. So ensuring access to affordable financing for clean energy in these regions is presented as both an economic necessity and a moral imperative.
This study also points out that some major recent global events, maybe surprisingly, have actually accelerated the transition.
That's an interesting observation they make, yes.
Yeah.
While there were initial fears about supply chain disruptions, events like the COVID-19 pandemic and particularly Russia's war in Ukraine have, since 2020, actually accelerated defossilization efforts. They note that renewable energy costs rose slower than fossil fuel costs in 2022 and started falling again in 2023. And the war in Ukraine really solidified political support for energy independence, driving major policies like the EU's Repower EU plan and the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. These are diversifying supply chains and speeding up the transition globally.
It sounds like they see this as creating a sort of clean energy manufacturing renaissance.
They do. They point out that cumulative global wind and solar capacity have been doubling incredibly rapidly. They estimate that as few as around 60 large manufacturing facilities globally could potentially meet total global energy demand with renewables by 2035-2040.
Just 60. That seems manageable.
Right. And this level of build-out would also create a huge number of jobs. They estimate over 120 million globally.
What about the barriers the study identifies what's still getting in the way?
Well, they highlight policy barriers mainly. The need for smoother coordination between national and local governments, for instance. Overcoming the power of regulated monopolies that can sometimes hinder new competition from renewables. And ensuring the strategic and responsible siting of new infrastructure to minimize negative social and environmental impacts.
Siting is always a challenge.
It is. But they estimate about 70% of potential negative impacts from renewable deployment could be mitigated with proper planning and siting, particularly in places like the U.S. The core message is that legislation should actively accelerate the transition, not inadvertently postpone it.
Okay, and finally, the study talks about the role of negative emissions technologies, or NETs. What part do they play in getting back to the Holocene?
This study says that nets are needed, yes, even with the rapid build-out of renewables. Specifically to remove legacy CO2 from the atmosphere and actually get back to Holocene conditions within the next century or so. However, they note these technologies are currently less mature and generally more costly than renewables.
So definitely not a magic bullet then, and certainly not an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels.
Absolutely not. The authors are very clear on this point. Developing and scaling nets must not be used to justify continued emissions. Both rapid emission reductions and carbon removal are required to meet the Holocene goal.
Both are needed.
Exactly. They suggest market creation is needed to jumpstart innovation in nets, perhaps requiring $10 billion more annually in investment. They even float the idea of an international CO2 removal fund, maybe managed by institutions like the World Bank or IMF, funded by wealthy countries based on their historic emissions.
Interesting idea. And they prioritize certain types of carbon removal.
Yes, they strongly prioritize nature-based solutions like afforestation, reforestation, and soil carbon sequestration. They see a large potential here, up to maybe 11.5 gigatons of CO2 removed annually. And these have significant co-benefits too, like preserving cultures, enhancing biodiversity, improving ecosystems.
Makes sense. And they wrap up this whole section with a call for clearer communication and kind of combating pessimism.
Right. They argue that doomerism, while understandable given the scale of the problem, is often based on outdated information about the feasibility and cost of the clean energy transition. They believe the renewable electrification pathway is technically achievable much faster than commonly assumed, potentially by 2035, certainly well before 2050. And they urge everyone involved to share this more positive, yet still urgent message of climate restoration.
Okay, so to sum up, this study, Accelerating the Renewable Energy Revolution to Get Back to the Holocene, paints a pretty clear picture. Current climate targets aiming for 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming are seen as dangerously insufficient, given the immense, often underestimated cost of pollution and the rising risks of triggering irreversible tipping points.
And it argues the necessary goal is actually climate restoration, returning to Holocene-like conditions, a goal that maybe wasn't considered feasible before but now appears potentially within reach, perhaps within a century.
And this feasibility is driven largely by the rapid, almost revolutionary technological and economic progress in renewable energy and storage, creating a pathway that is not just environmentally necessary, but also potentially macroeconomically profitable, especially when you account for those massive avoided costs from pollution deaths and damage.
Exactly. Combined with strategic policy shifts, targeted financing, and addressing existing barriers, the authors believe we have the tools to accelerate this transition dramatically. And they stress that both rapid emission cuts and carbon removal are essential. But carbon removal must not be an excuse for delay. Both have to happen.
Yeah, this study really lays out a stark contrast, doesn't it, between the immense ongoing costs and risks of sticking to current targets, and the potentially profitable, healthier pathway offered by accelerating towards climate restoration through renewables.
It definitely shifts the framing from just managing a crisis to actively building a better, more stable future.
So, reflecting on this study and the picture it paints, highlighting the high human and economic costs of the status quo versus this potentially profitable pathway to climate restoration via renewables. Here's a final thought for you listening. What do you think is the biggest barrier standing in the way of accelerating this transition as rapidly as the study suggests is possible and necessary? Is it primarily a technical challenge still, an economic one, or is it something else entirely, perhaps social acceptance or political will, something to think about?